Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have another great guest, Mark Wolynn. He's the author of a great book. We're going to get to that in a second as we continue our journey through trauma. Before we get started, if you want to support our podcast, make sure to share and subscribe. So our guest today, again, is Mark Wolynn. That's Wolynn. He's director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco, is a leading expert in the field of inherited family trauma, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. He's a sought-after lecturer. He teaches at hospitals, clinics, conferences, universities, and teaching centers around the world. Mark is the author of the great book we're going to be talking about today called It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. He's also the winner of the 2016 Nautilus Book Award in Psychology. It Didn't Start With You has been translated over 20 languages, folks. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Mind, Body, Green, MariaSchreiber.com, Elephant Journal, and Psych Central. And his poetry has also been published in the New Yorker. We can be here all day. You've got a great bio, fascinating stuff. So let's not waste any more time and let's get started. And welcome to the show. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Carlos. I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you very much for being here. This is a fascinating read. And as I told the audience, we're going through a journey through trauma. And we know a lot of times people have their traumas and they have to go through their journeys and rediscover themselves, get those hidden selves that we have that we've lost during that trauma. But before we get into all that, can you define inherited family trauma for us?
Absolutely. Let's say one of our parents or our grandparents lost their mother or father when they were young, or our mother or father was sent away or placed in an orphanage or foster care, or maybe one of their siblings died tragically when they were young. An event like this, any of these events, can break the heart of the family. Now, the reaction to the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. The feelings, the sensation, specifically the stress response, the way the genes express, this can pass forward to the next generation, to our children, to our grandchildren, affecting them in a similar way, even though they didn't personally experience the trauma. And now there's substantial biological evidence that demonstrates this.
That's amazing. You know, I guess there are different types of trauma as well, and it also varies depending on the age they feel the trauma.
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
And how can trauma be passed from a parent to a child?
So, okay. When a trauma happens, it changes us. So this is the important thing. Literally, it causes a chemical change in the DNA. And this changes the way our genes function, sometimes for generations. So what will happen is this trauma happens, and then because of this event, a chemical tag, a epigenetic tag attaches to the DNA and tells the cells, hey, use this gene or ignore this gene, enabling us to better deal with this trauma. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to a situation that's similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma happened to our parents or grandparents, occurred in 2 generations ago. So we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. I'll give you an example. If our grandparents come from a war-torn country, so let's say people are being shot, or bombs are going off, or uniformed men are lining people up in the square, taking people away, our grandparents would develop epigenetically a response and pass forward a skill set from that response. Maybe it's sharper reflexes. Maybe it's quicker reaction times. Maybe it's some other reaction to the violence to help them survive this trauma. But the problem is now we've received this skill set to help us survive the trauma that they experienced. So the problem is we could also inherit a stress response with the dials set to 10. And here we are, not in a war experience prepared for a catastrophe that's never arriving. And so we don't make this link. Here we are with our anxiety, with our hypervigilance, with our depression, with our shutdown. And we never make the link that it's connected with our parents and our grandparents, Dr. Carlos. We just think we're wired this way. That's what we think. Well, that's how I am. I'm just wired this way. And then these gene changes, as we're now learning through science, this is what's transmitted to our children and our children's children.
That's the scary thing to me too. You kind of hit one of my pet peeves. A lot of times people think that this is determined. They have this personality that's deterministic for the rest of their life, and they're wired and stuck. And I know we're going to get into that in a little bit later too, finding out more about it. That's the other thing too. You kind of made me think about how trauma has been around with all of our families for centuries. I mean, if you think about the Middle Ages, I'm sure we've had relatives in the past, and the trauma that they've encountered too during war-torn times. Let me go to scientific research. You know, you cover a lot of that in your book, Behind Inherited Family Trauma. What is that?
That's an important question. I'm glad you asked me, because, you know, why we're not looking back as far as the Middle Ages, though in a way we could, because the scientists can uncover a 3-4 generation link. So, you know, in humans, we can find a 2-generation link, you know, because it takes 12 to 20 years to get a generation in humans. The reason for this is now, because we can only see 2 generations in humans, we've got to look at studies with rodents, mice, and rats, because first of all, we can get a generation in 12 to 20 weeks. And mice and humans have a similar genetic makeup. Over 90% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with over 80% being identical. I'll give you an example of some of the research in inherited trauma. There's a study which I love because it's very graphic and demonstrative in this way. At Emory Medical University in Atlanta, they make male mice fear a particular scent, cherry blossom-like scent. Whenever the mice smells the smell, they shock the mice. And right in that first generation, they see changes in the blood, in the brain, and in the sperm. Right in the brain, there's enlarged areas where the brain has literally changed, where there's a greater amount of smell receptors so that the mice could detect this scent at lesser concentrations. In other words, right there, those first generation of shocked mice, their brains had epigenetically adapted to protect them. So the researchers have an idea. They go, okay, let's take some of that sperm where we also see these changes, and let's impregnate female mice that are not shocked. And let's take a look at what happens. Well, the amazing thing that happens in the second and third generations is the mice, the pups and the grandpups, become jumpy and jittery just by smelling the smell. So in other words, they've inherited the stress response without directly experiencing the trauma themselves. That's one study, but you know, one of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics is they separate baby mice from their mums, and not even for a long time. And again, the biological, the chemical, the molecular effects can be observed for 3 generations. So in one study, I'll just mention another study. Researchers prevented their babies, prevented the females from nurturing their pups for up to 3 hours a day. That's it. For the first 2 weeks of life. That's it. Just that little bit. And later in life, these babies, their offspring, they exhibited behavior, these little mice, similar to what we call depression in humans. What was interesting is as the symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged, which is similar to us. The older we get, often our symptoms exacerbate. And then surprisingly, another piece of the study is some of the males did not express these behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes to their female offspring in this particular study. That's like fathers going off to war, coming back numb from the trauma, and daughters carrying their father's fight, flight, or freeze response. His his shaking, his terror, his shutdown. But what we know from all the studies is it's not just fathers and daughters, because trauma is unfortunately an equal opportunity employer. Male children and female children are equally imprinted, equally impacted by a mother or a father's trauma. Um, for those of you interested who are listening, every week news studies are released. I put them on my Facebook page, Facebook/Mark Wolynn, and you can, here, I'll give you an idea of one that I love. Recent study in Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry, follows mothers who suffered trauma as children and found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression or bipolar disorder. And then there's a recent Tufts University study that found that men who suffered trauma as children were able to pass their anxiety onto their children through their sperm. And what's cool about this study is it's the first study that links human sperm and mice sperm. It shows the same changes, the same non-coding RNA changes that are found in mice in the labs that were traumatized as pups.
Wow, that's really, it's eye-opening and scary all at the same time. Wow, incredible stuff. Let me ask you this. How can someone tell then that he or she might be suffering from inherited trauma?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Look, we can be born with a depression or an anxiety. That's true, and never separated from the events of the past. There are the events of the previous generation. But we can also experience a fear or a symptom, Dr. Carlos, that strikes suddenly or unexpectedly as soon as let's say we reach a certain age, and or we experience a certain milestone or event in our lives. For example, as soon as we get married or go to have a kid. Here, I'll give you an example. I write about this woman in the book. She loves her husband, or her fiance. Loves him. He's the greatest guy in the world. She wants to get married, but all of a sudden she gets married and she's feeling trapped and she doesn't get it. She's saying, I don't get it. I love this guy, but I just can't stand it. I want to leave. So I ask her about her family history, and we find out that both grandmothers had been given away as child brides, one at 9 and one at 12 in Iraq, to much older men. Now, what was so cool is the trauma expressed differently in each of her sisters. So she feels trapped when she gets married. The other sister marries a man 35 years older, like the grandmothers did, and the other sister refuses to get married at all. So that's one trigger, getting married. Age is another trigger. At 30, we look at our spouse, our partner, our union. We look at our partner, and all of a sudden, at 30, we shut down, not connecting it to the fact that grandma becomes a widow at 30 and never marries again. I'll give you another trigger. We move to a new place, and all of a sudden we become depressed, and we don't know why, but it's depressed like our ancestors that were persecuted or forced out of their homeland or suffered a lot of death or starvation and had to leave. Here's another one. Okay, we get rejected by our partner, and the grief is insurmountable, Dr. Carlos. And it takes us back to an earlier grief that we don't remember, a break in the attachment with our mother. So we have to look at these events, these triggering events, and follow the breadcrumb trail, follow the stream. One woman came to me not long ago, and she was just panicked. And I said, what's going on? She said, I just have had this anxiety. And I said, for how long? She goes, I don't know, 7, 8 months. I go, what happened 7, 8 months ago? Well, that's when I got pregnant. So she's a pregnant woman. And, that was like an ancestral alarm clock was ringing in her body. So she's consumed with anxiety. And I started asking her, what's your worst fear? Which is one of my questions in my book. What's the worst thing that could happen to you? If your life suddenly fell apart, if things went terribly wrong, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? And she says, I'll harm my baby. And I said, did you ever harm a baby? She said, no, of course not. And I said, did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? And she's about to say no, Dr. Carlos. She goes, no. And all of a sudden she just starts to glaze over. And she remembers a story she was told as a child. her grandmother, as a young woman, lit a candle, caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire. Baby's upstairs, can't get the baby out, the baby dies. And then she says, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And that's also one of the things I talk about in my book. Exclusion creates rejection. Whatever is rejected or pushed away creates fertile ground for reliving and repetition. So after she makes the link, of course, we can work together and heal the pattern.
Wow, that's a powerful story. Again, folks, the book is called It Didn't Start With You. You definitely want to go find that book. You can get it on Amazon.com as well. How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. I guess my next question would be, many of us have trauma in our family histories, you know that, and yet not everyone manifests it, though, inherited family trauma. Why do some people tend to or seem to relive and others don't? And you kind of alluded to it in this story you just gave, too.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect lead-in question to, where I want to go, actually. It's great. Because, look, epigenetics is just one piece of the puzzle. That's just one piece. Embryologists have known for 100 years that when grandmom is 5 months pregnant with our mom, the egg that will one day become us is already there in our mother's womb at 5 months of fetus and our grandmother's womb. So, if you extrapolate, just think about it. If grandma has a trauma and mom's already in her womb and we're one of those eggs, Bruce Lipton takes that further when he says a mother's emotions are chemically communicated to the fetus through the placenta, which can biochemically alter genetic expression. So these are all pieces that are in there. But what I want to talk about is what seems to anchor these traumas. What seems to create these repetitions is when traumas aren't talked about, when the healing is incomplete because the pain is too great, the grief is too great, the shame, the embarrassment, the rejection, the anger, whatever. And we can't heal because we're pissed, we're shut down, we're having a response to the trauma, the grief. Or the people in the family system, they're excluded or they're rejected. Basically, there's not been any resolution. Then aspects of these traumas can show up in later generations. In other words, unconsciously, we'll repeat the pattern or share a similar unhappiness as our parents and grandparents until that trauma finally has a chance to heal. I mean, Freud talked about this. Freud observed this over 100 years ago when he talked about repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsion. The contraction of the trauma is seeking its expansion. So it keeps repeating, looking for a new, better healing outcome.
Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. And I know we're heading towards now trying to solve this.
Okay, so good question. What do we do about it, right? Because I've only given you the bad news that we're all in the same boat and it's sinking. Well, actually, there's a lot of really good news, Dr. Carlos. Researchers are now able to reverse trauma symptoms in mice, and the implications are vast. So when traumatized mice are exposed to positive experiences, it changes the way the DNA expresses. And mice aren't the only ones, of course, that this is significant for, because technically, let's go back to the science. Technically, the positive experiences inhibits the enzymes that cause one of the factors, DNA methylation and histone modifications. These are two of the mechanisms of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. There's a researcher in Switzerland at the Zurich Brain Institute, University of Zurich. She placed traumatized mice that she traumatized in the lab as adults now into positive and low stress environments. And their trauma symptoms reverse, their behaviors improve. There's changes in the DNA methylation, which prevented the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. This is key. And then remember those mice I talked about that were shocked whenever they smelled that scent? They were made to fear that scent?
Absolutely.
The same researcher teaches them, Brian Diaz, teaches them not to fear it by repeatedly exposing them to that scent later and not shocking them. So these mice no longer showed the heightened sensitivity to the scent. They no longer, their sperm lost the fearful epigenetic signature that could pass into future generations. And then there's new research just a couple months ago from Australia that found that people can recover from PTSD and have positive responses biologically, such as resilience, post-traumatic growth. And this is exciting news. So to heal, to put it in a nutshell, you and I, we, all of us listeners, all of us watching this, we've got to have positive experiences that can change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these positive experiences. And then when we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, but we also, new ways that our brain wires, but we also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain, like serotonin, dopamine, GABA, or we stimulate the release of hormones that are feel-good hormones that are useful, estrogen, oxytocin, even the way the genes are involved in our body's stress response, even the trauma shifting stress response can begin to function in a different way, an improved way. We can literally change the way our DNA expresses.
Interesting, because you made me think about protective factors, right? For a lot of people who deal with trauma or anything in their life, if they have a certain level of protective factors, it's interesting because now as I think about it, if your mom has had trauma, she gives birth to you, but if she's able to resolve her own conflicts, she's maybe able to, how would you say, provide those protective factors for that child? Am I thinking
exactly? Exactly. You mitigate what's already in the process so that it doesn't pass forward. Absolutely. That's such a key. That's why we need to work on our stuff so it doesn't pass forward to our kids. We need to have positive experiences. It can be anything like practices of receiving comfort or support or feelings of compassion, have a practice of compassion or a gratitude practice like Oprah told us, it's important, or a generosity practice, do something kind for someone every day, or a loving kindness practice, or practicing mindfulness. Ultimately, anything that allows us to dig into the feelings inside us of strength and peace and joy, because these types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and can help us reframe the stress response so it is a chance to downregulate. The idea is to pull traction away from the limbic system, our overactive amygdala, and to bring engagement to the forebrain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate these new experiences and our brains can change. We know from mindfulness studies that practicing mindfulness actually shrinks the amygdala, which can grow 2 times its normal size in those of us that are highly traumatized. And it thickens the prefrontal cortex.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Again, folks, I guess my last question would be, what if we don't know our family history? What if we're adopted or our parents are deceased? How does that work?
Yeah, and again, that's a really good question, because that information lives in our trauma language. So one of the things I do in the book is, I teach people how to listen for their own trauma language. So I have a lot of questions. One of them I shared with you listeners when I said, "What's your worst fear?" Even if we don't know what happened to us, if we just look at our fears, if we just look at our unexplained symptoms, if we look at our self-destructive tendencies or our self-sabotaging behaviors, when we drink, when we freeze, it lives in the symptoms of an illness that appear right after one of these events that I talked about earlier, or right when we reached a certain age that I talked about earlier. It's everywhere. It's in our relationship struggles, in the repeated ways we deal with money, success, abundance. All of this forms a breadcrumb trail, and it gives us more than a glimpse of what might have happened to us, even if we don't know the family history, even if it's been lost or kept secret, or our parents aren't talking, or they're passed away, or we're adopted, but it gives us the experience just following. Look, when I work with a client, the first thing I do is I listen for our trauma language. This language is either verbal or nonverbal. When it's verbal, it lives in the words we use to describe our issues, our relationships, our difficult relationships, our deepest fears, our anxieties. It, it, when this trauma language is nonverbal, just as I'm saying, it lives in our behaviors and symptoms. It's there. The unusual symptoms that appear after an unsettling event. So it's key to tune in and reflect and contemplate our behaviors so we can heal. Yeah.
Great stuff. Great stuff. I guess my last question would be, can you share some tips on how to break the cycle of inherited family trauma?
It would be my pleasure. So one of the things that we talked about earlier is no exclusion, no rejection, because this creates fertile ground for reliving. So when we, how can I say it? When we carry trauma and the trauma tightens us and we don't talk about it, that's one of the ways the repetition regenerates in our children. So if we or one of our children, the first thing I'm going to say, are struggling with unexplained symptoms, depression, anxiety, OCD, phobias, destructive behaviors, we've got to shake the family tree and see what falls out. I mean, what family secrets have been hidden? What stories didn't get told? What traumas never healed all the way? Sometimes we have to ask our parents or cousins or aunts or uncles to sort of get the whole story so we can put the pieces together. And then secondly, we've got to talk about these traumas in our family history and try to work through them so they're not passed down to future generations. The more we know about these traumas, the more we talk about them, the more we're able to bring relief to our kids and to their kids who could be struggling without a clue as to why. I found that if we ignore the past, it comes back to haunt us. Yet when we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns. And then lastly, we've got to have these positive experiences that calm the brain stress response. And mainly, we've got to let these experiences have meaning for us, Dr. Carlos. We've got to make them a daily practice. We've got to change our brain, have practices that allow us to stay in our bodies, stay with the sensations in our bodies, integrate the parts of us that are fragmented. Yeah, yeah, that's it.
That's a great point. That's one of the things we see in trauma. A lot of times our divided selves or fragmentation, and we have to get back to wholeness, as I guess Jung would have said. Really fascinating conversation. Again, Mark, where can we get more information about you and what you're up to?
I have a website, Mark Wolynn, WOLYNN.com, and listeners can, purchase one of my streamable trainings or work with me or one of the people I've trained, or just it's a whole resource of cases and stories, and people can dive deeper into this field of inherited family trauma. We need to look there. When we therapists are looking at a case, we've got to expand that horizon a little bit to not just look at childhood trauma and attachment trauma, which is so essential, but then what creates attachment trauma? What happened in the past that made our mom not able to parent in the way that would give the most attunement to the child? Traumas affect parenting, is what I want to say. And family traumas, inherited traumas, can affect parenting for generations and attachment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, again, it's Mark Wolynn, WOLYNN, for those listening on the audio podcast. The book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. It's a fabulous read, folks. I highly recommend it. Go get that. If you're watching us on YouTube, well, you can see us. Make sure you share and subscribe and hit that like button. We truly would appreciate it. Thank you so much again, Mark, for being here.
Oh, Dr. Carlos, it was my pleasure. It was good to meet you and hang out with you.
Likewise. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll catch you next time.